Dr. Mark Jangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I want to talk about ethical disagreement. Most people imagine ethical disagreements as cases where everyone accepts the same facts, but applies different moral principles, yielding different conclusions. And this is the way you typically think about it, right? Like you and I disagree about principles, and so we need to argue about those principles. That's why we're ending up, given the same facts, we're ending up with different conclusions about what is ethical, right? That's a standard thing. Analogize this in perceptual terms to the classic rabbit-duck illusion. Remember, there's a stimulus, you can see it as a rabbit or you can see it as a duck. Two observers may see different things, but they still agree on the strokes on the page, the underlying data, the underlying facts. These are ambiguity illusions. So typical notion of what an ethical disagreement is that you agree on all the facts, but you have differing principles. The same as looking at the same rabbit-duck illusion, but something about the way your mind sees things and interprets ends up seeing it as a rabbit, whereas I see it as a duck. That's the typical kind of model of ethical disagreement and an analogy in the perceptual world in terms of coming up with a hypothesis or how you perceive a stimuli. But there is a more profound kind of illusion, the kind that I've been involved with in some of my old work on why we see illusions. The geometrical illusions are one great class, and the herring illusion in particular, which I'll show here. In these cases, the brain doesn't just choose between interpretations that are consistent with the stimulus. Instead, what happens is that you perceive a stimulus that isn't there at all. These two vertical lines are physically straight on the page, yet your visual system sees them as bowing outward. This happens because perception is functional and forward-looking. It's anticipating what the world will look like by the time your perception in your brain is constructed. Right, this is what I call perceiving the present. But the key here, in terms of sort of analogizing this to ethical disagreement, is that these are what I call inconsistent perceptions, inconsistent illusions in some sense, because the perception that you get of the world is not even consistent with the facts. It's not even consistent with the data or the stimulus on the page. Now, this is much more similar to what a lot of ethical disagreements are like. In real-world ethical disagreements, during mass hysterias and social manias, it's very often this second kind of illusion that it's analogous to. Sociopolitical communities don't typically begin by examining shared facts and applying different principles. They often begin instead with a distinctive ethical perception, usually a membership signal, and only then reshape the facts to make that ethical perception, that judgment, seem justified. Once the facts have been rewritten, they can use the same principles their opponents hold and still reach the predetermined conclusion that differs from their opponents. So it's not same facts plus different principles implies a different ethics. Instead, it's different facts plus the same old principles that everybody shares, leading to different ethics. For example, in the COVID mask mania, masks are good began as a membership signal. And that was at a time when the actual evidence and expert advice said otherwise. Said, no, nobody should wear a mask. They don't work. All the RCTs said they don't work. That's what they were saying in March. But once it mattered socially to these communities, they began to wear it as a signal saying, I care about people and COVID, and I think it's important. It began being used as a membership signal in that sociopolitical community. And so after that, the communities generated a cascade of post hoc studies that show that masks work. Right? They appear and they culturally evolve to support the prior moral position, allowing them to claim ethical consistency without changing any principles. Membership signal culturally evolved into virtue signal. Right? And likewise, the immediate genocide cries on 10/7 functioned first as a declaration of allegiance, and only afterward did its adherents selectively reinterpret events, quotes, and casualty numbers to construct a world in which genocide simply had to be occurring. In both cases, the ethical principles never changed. That is, they still shared the same kinds of ethical principles everybody else did. The facts change. They evolved to have new kinds of facts. The evolution was masks went from not working to suddenly being justified as working after all with all these observational studies. And that's what you'll find. You find that when you're having these arguments, no matter how much you talk to them, Their principles are very often semi-reasonable, right? They're not necessarily disagreeing with you with the principles, but they are so committed to the absolutely absurd idea that masks work. And it is absurd. The RCT said don't do it. They told us not to wear them. It is a viral aerosol smoke going through the air. It can't possibly be stopped by something with all these gaps in it, right? It's impossible. It doesn't even make sense on its face. Genocide, completely absurd. Where you find your inability to talk to these people is not by a chasm of principles, but by a chasm of facts. The socio-political communities evolve the facts that they need so that they can hold the ethical positions they began with. That's the similarity in both of these cases. And this undermines the entire way that we typically think of ethical disagreements. Again, it's not that, oh, your community and my community differ on the principles, and so we have to argue about what are the correct principles, lest we can't really talk to each other. No, that's not what drives a lot of these kinds of arguments. These kinds of arguments are because cultural evolution pushes socio-political communities to develop their own perception of the facts. That is completely false. It's a kind of socio-political hallucination, post hoc created to justify the ethical position they began with and that defines their community. And that was your science moment.